Hi everyone, today I'm going to be doing my July wrap-up, so I'll go over everything that I read in July. I kind of want to try a few different things this month, so let me know down in the comments how you like them. First of all, I'll start off with doing a few stats. So this month I read a total of 9 books, and then there were 2 that I did not finish. Out of those 11 books, 7 were fantasy, 4 were science fiction. 9 of them were adult, 1 was young adult, and then I actually had 1 that was middle grade, which is pretty unusual for me. And also out of those books, 4 of them were new releases, as in they came out either this past month or just, in the last few months. So usually in my wrap-ups, I just kind of talk about books in the order that I read them in the past month and make it a little bit more of a narrative. But I kind of want to try this time talking about the books that I liked the least first and then gradually working my way up to my favorites. So this is just a way to try something a little bit different, I guess. I will also probably give more time to talking about the books that I did not do a separate review for, and I will let you know when I do have a review up of a book that I'm talking about. So I'll probably talk a little bit less about those books. On YouTube, I don't usually like to give books star ratings, and I'm not going to do that now, but this is just going to be in order of general enjoyment. So first of all, the 2 books that I DNF'd were both science fiction books that I was reading for the Hugo Awards. The first one was Luna by, I think it was called Luna New Moon, but it's in the Luna series by Ian MacDonald, and I just could not really get into it. I read about a third to a half, and then I told myself I was going to come back to it, and after a few weeks passed, I realized that I was not going to go back to it. So my problem with that book was just it was a little too brutal for me. I did not like any of the characters. They were all doing horrible things to each other, and I just didn't want to read any more of it. The other one that I DNF'd was The City in the Middle of the Night by Charlie Jane Anders. I talked about this a little bit in my wrap-up for the Hugo Award for Best Novel, but basically I think there's just, for some reason, I have a hard time reading her writing. I also didn't really like her previous book that I tried that did really well and was popular, and I don't think it's anything about her or the quality of her work. For some reason, it does not click with my brain, and I should probably just accept that. So other than the DNFs, the only book that I read this month that I didn't really care for was A Song of Wraiths and Ruin by Roseanne A. Brown. I have a review up for this that talked about why I didn't really enjoy it. It's a little bit of a ranty review though, so be warned about that. I do want to try reading a little bit more YA. I don't know if maybe why I didn't really like this book. Part of the reason might have been because it was YA, but I think there were also just some other issues that I had with it. But I have seen that most people are absolutely loving this book, so please don't let me deter you from checking it out if it sounds interesting to you, because it really seems like a lot of people are enjoying it. Part of the problem was also that I had super high hopes for that book because of what I had heard about it, and also just the premise and everything about it just sounded like something that I would really like, so I think I was just especially disappointed that I didn't enjoy it. Everything I'm going to mention after this is a book that I at least generally liked. So like I mentioned, this isn't an exact ranking, but I'm sort of trying to put them in the order I enjoyed them, but it just depends how I'm feeling right now, I guess. So a new release that I was very excited for was The Angel of the Crows by Katherine Addison. The reason I was so excited for this was because her only other book, The Goblin Emperor, is probably one of my favorite books of all time at this point. It was definitely at least one of my favorite books of 2020. I think it's an amazing book, and so I was really just excited to have anything else from her. But even before I read The Angel of the Crows, I started seeing some really mixed reviews of it, and I decided to give it a try anyway. And in general, I liked it, but it was definitely not The Goblin Emperor. The Angel of the Crows is a very direct retelling of Sherlock Holmes, except in this story, Sherlock is an angel named Crow, and this is set in a London where there are a bunch of supernatural creatures like werewolves and vampires and angels. So other than that, it is a pretty straightforward retelling of the original Sherlock stories, and that's sort of what people complained about the most with this, I think, is that there wasn't enough value added with all the supernatural elements. I have to say, I do agree with that. I don't have a problem with the fact that this book started out as Sherlock Holmes fan fiction. I think there have been so many different Sherlock retellings and different settings and different versions, whether it's movies, television, books, sequels, authorized sequels, unauthorized sequels. So there's really like a long-standing tradition of doing Sherlock in different ways. But I do kind of agree with the people that said that this one just wasn't different enough. There was this additional Jack the Ripper plot thread in the book, but other than that, yeah, it was basically just a few of the most famous stories retold with these slightly different characters and supernatural elements. There was a vampire Moriarty, which was honestly pretty awesome, and I did like this idea of Sherlock not being human and being this sort of otherworldly person that didn't always quite understand people, so that worked pretty well. I think that Katherine Addison is an amazing writer, and I did genuinely enjoy reading this book. It's just, compared to The Goblin Emperor, it was just, it was fine. In the end, I enjoyed it just fine. It's probably not even the best published Sherlock fanfiction that I've even read. I didn't feel particularly compelled to give it its own review video because I just didn't have a lot to say about it. And most of the stuff that does differentiate it from the original stories would be complete spoilers. So yeah, if you really like Sherlock Holmes or you really like Katherine Addison, there's nothing wrong with reading this book. You might enjoy it, but it's really nothing special. Another new release that I was super excited for was Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. Mexican Gothic is a Gothic horror novel that's set in 1950s Mexico. It's about a young woman who gets asked to go check on or visit her cousin who has recently married into this family, and now it seems like the cousin is maybe going insane. She's saying that the house is haunted and all sorts of other crazy things. So the main character gets asked to go stay with her and find out what's going on. So of course this leads her to staying in a creepy house with a creepy family in a remote location, which is, the setup for probably most Gothic horror novels. So I took kind of a gamble on this book for me because I don't really like horror very much, but I've enjoyed quite a lot of Gothic novels, including things like Rebecca, which this got compared to, and I also loved her last book, Gods of Jade and Shadow, and I really do think she's a great writer. In the end, this book it was a little too much straight up horror for me. The end was a little too gross for my taste, but that doesn't mean it wasn't good. I knew that there was a chance that this book would be a little too much towards the horror side. I mean, it's, practically the Mexican Gothic thing is in the title, so I really can't blame this on the book at all. I really enjoyed most of it. I thought the main character was really well written. I liked almost everything about it, except I just got too grossed out and creeped out by the very end. So that's kind of on me. But if you really like horror, or you like Gothic horror, you really have to read this book. It is so good. I've mentioned before that I'm just a very easily grossed out person, like I'm very squeamish, so this book, it was just a little bit too much for me and I didn't feel great when I finished it, but I still enjoyed the writing a lot, right up to the point where I was disturbed. The next book I'm going to talk about is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, which is the first book in her new series. It's the first urban fantasy book that she's written. I think it's basically the first novel, at least, that she's written that wasn't set on a secondary world, so this is something very different from her, and it definitely comes across as a very personal book from her. I definitely have a little bit of an N.K. Jemisin block, and I don't really know why. I have started all of her series, and that includes, I think her first series was the Inheritance trilogy. I read the first book of that. I read the first book of her duology, which I can't remember what it's called, I think Dream Blood or something like that. And then I read all of the Broken Earth trilogy, which is fantastic. And I've always thought that she was a fantastic writer. Her ideas are really original, like everything about it is good. It just never quite affects me the way I wanted it to. Like I never really get drawn in the way I want to with her writing, except for maybe the Broken Earth trilogy, which, I mean, obviously every single book in that trilogy won a Hugo. There's very little to fault there. But I think the fact that her writing is really really compelling and also just technically fantastic is why I keep coming back to her books, even though I have several series of hers that I haven't finished. So I guess it's no surprise that I basically saw how good this book was without totally loving it, but I still would highly recommend reading it. I don't really know why I don't connect to her writing so much. I think it's not so much the characters. I think she tells epic stories in this very intimate, personal way, which should be super effective, but sometimes I find that I just don't get drawn into it the way I expect. So all of that being said, I think The City We Became is a really important book, and there's a reason that a lot of people are talking about it right now. In this setting, it's a world, I mean, it's our world, except that cities can basically come alive in these avatars where people basically end up embodying the city, but it only happens when the city gets to a certain point, both in history and people and all of that. So at the beginning of this book, New York City is about to be born, except there are dark forces at work that are trying to kill the cities or prevent them from being born. This book comes across as very intense and very personal, and it addresses a lot of issues that are really at the forefront of our society right now. And in general, N.K. Jemisin does what she always does, which is really continue to push the boundaries of the genre and have really original storytelling. I definitely haven't seen any urban fantasy like this before, and I'm sure that this book is going to have a really big impact. The one middle grade book that I read this month was Dragon Pearl by Yoon Lee. I can't remember the last time that I read a middle grade book, and honestly, I think the reason that I did it was because I read Yoon Lee's trilogy, The Machineries of Empire, which was this really complicated science fiction trilogy that I both enjoyed and struggled through at the same time because the ideas were just very hard to grasp, and I found it kind of hard to follow. So I was really intensely curious to see how this author would write middle grade. And it's completely different. I never would have guessed that it was the same writer, but I actually really enjoyed this story and I thought it was quite nice. I would recommend it if you want something light and enjoyable, but it still had, it had a real emotional core to it. It is science fiction, except in this world, not only have humans sort of gone out and colonized the universe, but also all these supernatural creatures from Korean mythology are also mixed among the humans. The main character is a fox spirit, and the fox spirits have had to hide themselves away because they are mistrusted by everyone else, both human and supernatural, because they are tricksters. They can shapeshift into anything, and they can also charm people, basically. So the main character is a young teenage girl, and at the beginning of the story, we find out that her brother, who had joined the Space Forces, has apparently deserted, and she becomes determined to prove that he didn't desert and to find where he is and hopefully bring him home. So it is her adventure going out into the world and trying to find her brother. I also really liked that this book had a young female protagonist who her main skills were in mechanics and engineering. I thought that that was really nice. And I overall really enjoyed this book. I also thought that the mix of science fiction and Korean mythology was really nicely done. It actually felt very natural the way it was integrated. It was kind of a science fantasy combination. And I also made me want to learn more about Korean mythology because it's probably one of the mythologies that I've heard about the least. Next, we have Leviathan Wakes. Overall, I enjoyed this one a lot. I still need to film a review for it. It was part of my Hugo Awards reading project. Overall, I thought this book was pretty epic. I can see why people are really into this series. I didn't connect to it super strongly. It was a little more action and plot driven and less character driven to my taste, and I think I just wasn't in the mood for really space opera-y action science fiction at the moment. But I can definitely see why it's popular, and there's a lot that this book does really well, so I'll have a review of this up pretty soon. This did end up just winning a Hugo Award for Best Series, so obviously a lot of people really like this. I'm also kind of tempted to just go and maybe watch the first season of the TV series now that I've finished the first book. I don't know if I should try to finish the whole series first before I watch the show, but that could take a little while, so we'll see. I'm looking forward to reading future books in this series and things being even more epic and maybe getting some more points of view as well. I think one of the things that I was less crazy about with this book was just I didn't love the two point of view characters all that much. Like I didn't feel like I connected with them, but overall, I think this is a good book. I have a short review up of Discount Armageddon by Seanan McGuire, which is the first book in the Encrypted series. The Encrypted series ended up coming a very close second to The Expanse in the Hugo Award for Best Series this year. I think I personally enjoyed it more. It definitely wasn't as epic. It was just a lot of fun. You can check out my review for more about what the series is about, but I found it to be just a very fun, quick urban fantasy read. with some really fun characters. So if that kind of series is your thing, then I definitely recommend checking that one out. Probably tied with Discount Armageddon for my second favorite thing I read this month was The Raven Tower by Anne Leckie. So if you've seen my review, you know that The Raven Tower is the book I ended up reading twice this month because I didn't like it the first time, which is kind of weird. I have really never done anything like that before. I don't know if I will again, but it was worth it because the second time I thought it was really great. So I'm finding it kind of hard to recommend this book because obviously it took more than one reading for me to get into it. But on the other hand, I think it's kind of brilliant. So you can watch my review of this as well. It basically, in a nutshell, is a Hamlet retelling that is also told in the second person from the point of view of a god who is a stone. So, you know, if that thought gets you feeling kind of engaged and excited, then go check out my review of The Raven Tower. So it's definitely a very uniquely told book, and I really connected to it and liked it in the end, but it's not the easiest read, and it is kind of told in a challenging way, which seems to be Anne Leckie's thing. Like, none of her books that I've read so far have been particularly straightforward. This book probably won't be for everyone, and I've definitely seen a lot of mixed opinions on it, but even so, it worked for me. That's all I can say. Surprising absolutely nobody, my favorite book this month was The Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty. This is the final book in the Devabad trilogy. I have been waiting for it pretty much since I turned the final page in book 2, and I was also really, really afraid that it was going to be a letdown, so I am very, very happy to report that it was not a letdown. It was a great conclusion to the trilogy. I'm sure you all know how hard it is to find a trilogy where all 3 books are good, but in this case, I think the Devabad trilogy did it. I found this to be a really satisfying conclusion. It basically fulfilled all of the promises that were set up in the first 2 books. I felt like the character arcs were really good. I thought actually the writing, like the character writing, was probably some of the best in the series so far. So I'm sad that this series is over, but I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what S.A. Chakraborty writes next. And I think it was a good place to end the series. I'm glad she didn't drag it out any further. But yeah, so that's, you know, both I really loved this and it's a little bittersweet that it's over, but this was definitely my favorite read of the month, even though I think it was the first or one of the first books that I read. So yeah, it's time to say goodbye to this, but I really enjoyed it. Also, I'm still feeling a little bit obsessed with this book because my husband is listening to it on audiobook right now, and he is just getting to the end, so I hear like dramatic scenes coming from other parts of the apartment while he's doing stuff. So, you know, it's still been very much at the forefront of my mind. Those are all the books that I read in July. Let me know if you've read any of these books. What did you think of them? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and thanks so much for watching.